Frank has had this same flip phone since 2011. Not an old iPhone he's being stubborn about, an actual flip phone, the kind your grandmother uses to call you on Sundays. His couch is the same brown corduroy monstrosity his college roommate left behind when he moved out, 22 years ago. He gets his haircut at the same barber shop for $12 cash only, and he still drives a Honda Civic with a cassette deck that technically still works, though nobody's tested it since the Clinton administration. If you met Frank at a barbecue, you'd feel a little bit sorry for him. You'd probably assume he's broke, or maybe just one of those guys who never really figured out how to adult properly. And then Frank retired last spring at 58, and the number on his account when he walked out of that building for the last time was $1.4 million. Not from some genius investment, not from crypto, not from a rich uncle, not from anything remotely interesting, just from never upgrading anything ever for about 35 years straight. And once you understand exactly how boring the mechanism behind that number actually is, you're going to look at your own phone, your own car, and your own couch a little bit differently. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, financial psychology, and why the people who look the least impressive are so often the ones quietly winning. If you've ever caught yourself upgrading something you didn't actually need, stick around, because Frank's flip phone is about to make a lot more sense than it has any right to. This isn't a guy pinching pennies out of desperation. Frank made a completely normal, unremarkable salary his entire career, somewhere in the mid-50s to low 60s, working as a facilities coordinator for a mid-sized company nobody's heard of. He wasn't hiding a secret side income. He just, at some point decades ago, decided that things worked fine as they were, and then he stopped asking the question that most of us ask constantly without even noticing we're asking it: should I get a new one? Apparently, there's an entire mythology around Frank at his old job. One coworker swears his flip phone predates the company's founding, which isn't technically true, but says a lot about the impression it left. Someone else claims Frank once fixed the couch's one broken spring with a coat hanger and duct tape, rather than even consider replacing it, and the repair held for 4 more years. Whether every detail of Frank lore is 100% accurate almost doesn't matter, because the pattern behind it clearly is, and the pattern is the only part of this story that actually made it money. That question, should I get a new one, is probably the single most expensive sentence in the American vocabulary, and almost nobody tracks how often they say it. Your phone still makes calls, but there's a new one out, so should I get a new one? Your car runs fine, but your coworker just leased something nicer, so should I get a new one? Your couch has a small stain nobody but you has ever noticed, so should I get a new one? Each individual yes feels completely reasonable in isolation. It's $200 a year maybe. It's nothing. Except it's never actually nothing, and Frank is the walking flip phone carrying proof of that. Here's the part where we do the actual math, and I promise it's more fun than it sounds. Say you upgrade your phone every 2 years instead of running it into the ground, and the price difference averages out to around $400 a year. Upgrade your car every 4 or 5 years instead of every 10 or 12, and that gap runs about $3,000 a year. Furniture and a slightly nicer place than you strictly need, call it another $600 a year. Add it up, and you're somewhere around $4,000 a year, every single year, just in the gap between upgrading regularly and not upgrading at all. $4,000 a year invested at a reasonable 7% average return for 35 years comes out to somewhere north of $550,000. And that's before we even talk about Frank's actual retirement contributions, which is a whole separate pile of money compounding in the background the entire time. The upgrade gap alone is worth more than $500,000 by itself. There was no secret. The secret, if you can even call it that, was just refusing to ask, should I get a new one, for 3.5 decades. Somebody at the office once ran the numbers on Frank, half as a joke, roughly calculating how much he'd saved compared to an average coworker based on his phone, his car, and his modest apartment. The spreadsheet got passed around for laughs, everyone assuming it would show some mildly interesting gap. Instead, it showed a 6-figure difference before anyone had even accounted for what that money would have done sitting in an investment account the whole time. The joke spreadsheet stopped being funny pretty quickly once people actually looked at it. So why does this actually work psychologically? It's about something researchers call the hedonic treadmill, one of the sneakiest, most invisible forces in personal finance, because upgrading almost never feels like a financial decision while you're making it. It feels like a lifestyle decision, barely a decision at all. You don't think, I am now going to spend $3,000 extra this year on transportation. You think, hey, my lease is up anyway, might as well see what's out there. And that's exactly the trap, because each individual upgrade resets your baseline. Once you've had the nicer car for 6 months, the old one starts to feel unacceptable in a way it never actually was. Frank simply never let his baseline reset. His flip phone was never upgraded, so it never had the chance to feel outdated, because outdated is a comparison, and Frank stopped making the comparison decades ago. His coworkers used to rib him on the flip phone constantly. Somebody apparently offered him to buy him a smartphone as a joke birthday gift one year, and Frank just laughed and kept using the flip phone to decline the gift. He wasn't making some grand ideological stand against technology. It made calls, it sent texts, badly, T9 style, which should honestly qualify as its own form of cardio, but it worked, and Frank's entire financial philosophy seems to have been some version of, if it still works, why would I replace it? Now, here's the part where we push back a little on the obvious takeaway, because it would be easy to think Frank is simply a disciplined, willpower-driven guy who resisted temptation his whole life. Honestly, that's not really what happened. Frank didn't white-nickel his way past every shiny new gadget in the store. He genuinely stopped noticing them. The temptation disappeared because he removed himself from the comparison loop entirely. He didn't follow tech release cycles or scroll car ads. There was no willpower required because there was nothing to resist. That matters because willpower is a genuinely terrible long-term financial strategy. It runs out. Frank's approach required zero daily willpower because he'd structurally removed the trigger, not because he had some superhuman ability to say no. This is where it gets a little uncomfortable if you're honest with yourself, because most of us are constantly exposed to the trigger in ways Frank simply wasn't. Every app on your phone is quietly showing you what other people just bought. Every car commercial is engineered specifically to make your current, perfectly functional car feel embarrassing in comparison. The entire advertising economy exists to manufacture the feeling that what you have is no longer enough, and it's very good at its job. Frank wasn't smarter than you. He was just less exposed to a machine specifically designed to make everyone feel a little bit behind, all the time, on purpose. Let's talk about what this actually cost him socially, because I don't want to pretend there was zero price to pay. Frank did get teased. There's a real social cost to visibly opting out of the upgrade cycle. At his retirement party, a coworker gifted him, as a gag, a brand new top-of-the-line smartphone, still in the box, and Frank reportedly turned it over, laughed, thanked them sincerely, and quietly re-gifted it to his nephew a week later, because he genuinely had no use for it. But here's the thing that's easy to miss. Frank wasn't stressed about money for 35 years. He never had a car payment keeping him up at night. The social cost was small, occasional jokes at a barbecue. The financial cost of the alternative was over $500,000. That trade looks pretty lopsided once you put a number next to it. Here's the pitfall almost everyone falls into once they hear a story like Frank's. They assume the takeaway is never buy anything nice ever, deprive yourself completely. That's not it. Frank wasn't depriving himself. His stuff worked, his phone made calls, his couch held his weight just fine. He was simply not paying a premium for the feeling of newness on things already doing their job perfectly well. There's a real difference between frugal and deprived, and Frank landed cleanly on the frugal side of that line his entire adult life. The other pitfall is assuming this only works if you go as extreme as Frank, flip phone and all. It doesn't. Most people don't need to go from upgrading every 2 years to never upgrading at all. Even cutting your upgrade frequency in half captures a meaningful chunk of that gap. You don't have to become Frank. You just have to notice how often you're asking, should I get a new one on autopilot, without a functional reason behind the question, and start asking it a little less reflexively. So what actually made Frank rich? Not income, not some secret investment strategy, and definitely not luck. It was a boring, repeatable refusal to reset his own baseline every time something newer showed up. Every dollar he didn't spend chasing the feeling of newness got to go do something far more interesting instead, sitting quietly in an account, compounding year after year, while Frank kept using a phone that by any modern standard should not still exist. And look, I'm not telling you to go find a flip phone on eBay tonight and throw your smartphone in a lake to prove a point. That's not the lesson. The lesson is smaller and a lot less dramatic, which is that most of the upgrades filling up your life right now aren't decisions you actually made. They're decisions that got made for you by a notification, an ad, a coworker's new car in the parking lot, a subtle tap on the shoulder from an economy that profits every single time you decide the thing you have is no longer enough anymore. Frank stopped feeling that tap on the shoulder somewhere around 1989 and never really looked back to see what he was supposedly missing. If you're sitting there thinking about the last thing you upgraded that didn't actually need upgrading, you're not behind, and you're definitely not broke because you're bad with money. You just haven't had a reason yet to stop asking the question. Frank stopped asking it in 1989 and walked out with $1.4 million for his trouble. A beat-up Civic, and, as far as anyone knows, that same flip phone still sitting in a drawer somewhere, probably still fully charged, patiently waiting for a call that, statistically, is going to come in on somebody else's shiny upgraded phone instead. You don't need a flip phone to get there. You just need to notice how often you're saying yes to a question nobody's actually making you answer.